Great to have you here, Manoj, and great to be here in this beautiful city. A lovely break from our cold winter in Delhi. Um, so I'm looking forward to this conversation, Manoj.
So am I. Thank you.
Okay. This book that I have with me out here, I seriously suggest, especially young children, to read. And more than young children, I feel that it's something that is valid for everybody. Because, when I picked it up, I did because I wanted to read a little bit more about caste. And to be honest with you, most of my reading is concerning elections these days. So when this whole talk began, that caste census is a hot topic. And it's going to be something that's going to come up. Maybe the India Alliance wants to bring it up. So when I saw this book, I said, okay, must read about it. It's very well researched. And it got me thinking. It also got me thinking because I just felt that some of us who come from privileged backgrounds, and in our country, privilege just means not having to do a jaddojahed, not having to fight for education, or not having to worry too much about school fees and for higher education. Maybe just worry about EMIs and nothing beyond. But some of us who have been blind to casteism, which was perpetuated maybe by our ancestors, and we, by just not fighting it, let it continue for generations. And billions of us who should have taken this up in our daily lives, in our families, in our schools and colleges, and wherever we interacted with, we should have done it. So I think it got me thinking, and that's a success for an author, if you can get people thinking about your book.
Indeed.
So thank you for writing this. It must have taken several years of slogging over it. So tell us, why did you write this book? What motivated you, Manoj?
Thank you, Smita, for your very generous remarks. Before I respond to the question about or maybe I should respond to that. We will come to, why it is. The book was published in April. Since then, I have had many such book events in India and abroad. But speaking here is very special to me because, the subtitle of my book is Battles for Equality in Hindu India. Now, these battles for equality were fought all over the country, but most significantly in the old Madras presidency, of which Calicut was a part of the Madras presidency. It was part of what was known as the Malabar district, the old Malabar district. And this was where the battles were very intense because the level of untouchability here was something else. It was worse than in any other part of the country, and it's not for nothing that somebody like Swami Vivekananda, when he was on his Bharat Yatra, before he left for US on that historic visit to Chicago, he happened to come to this part and he was taken aback by what he saw. I mean, elsewhere in the country, he did see untouchability, but what he saw here was far more than that. If contact was the problem in other parts of the country, here proximity was enough. Mere approach was enough. If you were within a certain distance, that was considered polluting. So he called this area, I mean, it isn't anything like that now, but at that time it was so. He called this whole Malabar area a lunatic asylum. Now, this is to underscore the fact that Malabar and indeed Kerala state has progressed a great deal since then. It traversed a great deal on the scale of caste reform and equality. Maybe there's a bit of dialectics there. This was not too long ago the worst place as far as untouchability was concerned, but today it isn't so. I mean, in the earlier session, somebody like Mr. Sachidanand, an astute observer, was saying that Kerala is today, relatively speaking, a land of peace. He obviously meant that there's greater social harmony here. Not that there weren't incidents now and then of violence and oppression, But relatively speaking, it's a state that is known for not just high literacy, but also scoring high on human development indicators. So it's just to make that point that Malabar has moved a great deal, has traversed a great distance since, late 19th century. Now, coming to this question that Smita just asked, what prompted me to do it? As was said in the introduction to me, about me, I did a couple of books earlier uh, which were focused on mass violence targeting minorities. So this subject of violence in public life has been something of abiding interest to me. And what I originally set out to do was another book on mass violence, this time targeting Dalits. And the difference was that, unlike in the case of communal violence, there is a special law relating to caste atrocities. So I wanted to examine this conundrum. Why is there so much impunity for mass violence? Or why does it take place so often, despite this very rigorous law, which in the eyes of some is even draconian? So why is there so little by way of justice? Now that's the question I set out to examine. But what I found was, okay, there is this pattern of again and again, some arm or the other of the Indian state, be it the police, the prosecuting agency, the trial court, or the appellate courts, being instrumental in the culprits getting off the hook on the flimsiest of grounds. Now, it was very clear that what was happening was structural bias. Now, I wanted to know where this was coming from. Why was there so much of a gap between the rhetoric and reality about the rule of law in regard to caste? For that, I looked up existing literature, and I found that there is hardly anything dealing with this very vital aspect, that is the intersection of law and caste. Though there is a lot of work on caste otherwise, it's one of the most written about subjects, but surprisingly this vital aspect was neglected by academics and others. So I therefore had the need to go into archives myself, and I'm happy to see somebody from National Archives, Mrs. Jaya Ravindran, who more than anybody else at the National Archives was instrumental in helping generations of researchers, and she was a big help to me. She is a resident of Calicut, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. So they were all helpful to me in locating material unexplored, hitherto unexplored legislative and judicial archives relating to different aspects of caste reforms going back 2 centuries. So that is what led to such a fat book. This is not the kind of book that I meant to write. I meant to write a merely journalistic account, an extension of the kind of atrocities that I happen to cover in my career over 3 or 4 decades. But this is, I went into the domain of academics. I ended up writing legal history of caste by default. By default, every one of these 18 chapters has a lot of material. If you make an incremental addition to the existing material, that's justification enough for a book. But in this particular book, every chapter by default, I stress by default, I make quantum leaps in terms of new material.
That's true. It's, I think, the only book, as you mentioned, where caste and legal details, they intersect quite a lot. It's not just one atrocity after the other. It's not that kind of an academic book or a journalistic exercise. You mentioned about Swami Vivekananda coming to the Malabar region, and I was trying to hunt the exact location where I had read about it in your book, in which you said it was frustration of Swami Vivekananda in this area, not just because he saw so much of casteism practiced, but personally because he was not allowed to enter some temples in this area.
You're right, absolutely right. I must begin by saying that it's apt for us to be talking about Vivekananda's travails for the reason, for this happy coincidence, that today happens to be Vivekananda's birth anniversary, January 12th. So I have two reasons to be particularly happy to be talking today on the subject of my book. One is the location, Malabar, and the other is Vivekananda. And the temple where he had a problem, I mean, that's well recorded, that's not my finding, is Kodangalur, which is in Cochin area. As you well know that during the colonial period, Kerala was divided into three parts: Travancore, Cochin, these two were princely states, and Malabar, where we are sitting, Malabar region, was part of the Madras presidency.
Yeah, so I found that part interesting. And of course, then I wanted to know about how, certain things which one has read about, but not so much in detail, and what a difficult task it was, like for Chhatrapati Shivaji. What you mentioned about how he tried to get respectability as a ruler, because his caste was not accepted as a Kshatriya caste. And then what was that? So explain that. See, the reason I'm saying it is because both of us are storytellers, right? As journalists, we are storytellers. So while there is a whole lot of research which goes and the legalese which goes, I like the stories that you tell in your book.
Thank you. I totally relate to what you said about our being storytellers and the thrill we experience when we have some great story to tell, a story that people are either unaware of or stories that are counterintuitive, that run contrary to existing assumptions. And Shivaji's story is one such. If someone like Vivekananda couldn't enter that Kodangalur temple because, he happened to be a Shudra. I mean, Kayasthas are considered Shudras in Bengal presidency.
That was also quite a revelation, which I didn't realize. I mean, I don't know whether the audience out here will know. The Kayastha caste in North India is what your bureaucracy was all about.
Yeah.
So we've all dealt with the Kayasthas who, as journalists, we've had run-ins with the Kayastha IAS officers. Didn't realize that they're in their background, to reach where they have, they were considered Shudras at one point of time.
There were repeated rounds of litigation during the colonial period simply on this question of where a certain caste should be located in the Varna hierarchy. Varna, as you know, is a conceptual term, is a theoretical term. Jati or caste is the reality on the ground. So what you see are thousands of castes. So there were questions about, Brahmins, whether it's Varna or Jati, it's the same. So there was never any doubt about their preeminent position in the pole position in that hierarchy. They were always sitting pretty, benefiting more than any other caste from this oppressive system. But about others, there were doubts. So there were repeated rounds of litigation, and that's related to this question of Shivaji too. If I may come back to your original question about Shivaji. Now, Shivaji in his time was considered a Shudra. I mean, the Shudra is really the default category because other than Brahmins, whose overlap with the Varna hierarchy was beyond doubt, with the rest, there was always a question mark. And as it happened, over a period, Brahmins apparently took the view that even if scriptures talk about Chaturvarna, in Kali Yuga, there were only two Varnas, Brahmins and Shudras. And the reason they gave for the absence of Kshatriyas was a Pauranic legend about Parshurama. They said that...
Isn't this area Parashurama Kshetra?
Yeah, that's another story.
Another one, right?
Yeah. Oh, there are lots of such,
So
that's part of
I
India's
saw
diversity.
this when I was driving through South Karnataka and North Kerala, that there's this entire area was Parashurama Kshetra, which I didn't know about.
Yeah.
It's only now this revival of interest in that, and then the role of Parashurama in caste is what you talk about.
Yeah. So Parshurama, according to the Pauranic legend, is said to have exterminated all Kshatriyas because of the abuse of caste privilege on their part. Now, that being the story, they said to somebody like Shivaji, who ticked all the boxes as far as capability, guna and karma. These are the expressions that are used in Gita, in one very famous sloka. So there is divided opinion over a period. The way it is interpreted is, Varna is something that comes by caste, and then there is that other interpretation which is given that no, what that sloka means is that depending on your guna and karma, your caste is determined. But then there is no mechanism, there is no process through which somebody can upgrade themselves, or somebody is said, no, even if you are born in a high caste, because of your guna karma, you actually belong to a low caste. There's no such mechanism. There is nothing that corroborates this interpretation. But be that as it may, in Shivaji's time, the Brahmins of his kingdom, including his own Prime Minister, Pingle, who happened to be a Brahmin, said that you may be a great warrior, you may be a great administrator, but that's not good enough for you to be considered a Kshatriya. Why? Because of your fatal flaw of being born in a wrong community. You are born to a Bhosle community, which is a Shudra. Other than Brahmins, everybody is Shudras in their eyes. So, and this is at a time when Shivaji had just escaped from the Agra fort, and the reason that he was imprisoned by Aurangzeb in the first place was Aurangzeb's refusal to acknowledge him as a fellow sovereign, as a legitimate ruler in his own right. He referred to him as a bandit or some such thing. And when Shivaji fortuitously escaped from Agra and returned to his kingdom, he said, look, I need, for very strategic reasons. This is at a time when India was indeed vulnerable to invasions. And at a time like that, the elite of our society, Hindu society, was of the view that there was only, other than there being a Sattvic caste who are into intellectual pursuits, the rest of the population of India were all a servile class. There was no martial tradition in them. There was no capability in them of standing up to enemies, of defending their kingdom, and so on and so forth. That was the implication of their position, that they were only Shudras. So even to Shivaji, they said, you are only a Shudra. So he had to, as a result, go all the way, send emissaries all the way to Kashi to get access to Brahmins who could be said to have greater standing than Brahmins in his own kingdom. And they locate somebody called Gaga Bhatt, who concocts some lineage, a genealogy for Shivaji, saying that, okay, it is true that, Kshatriyas don't exist otherwise, but there is one small section that survived those purges of Parshurama, and that section lives into modern Rajasthan. It was at that time Rajputana. So he zeroes in on Sisodia, the community to which Rana Pratap belonged, who was a contemporary of Akbar, an ancestor of Aurangzeb, right? Now, this Akbar's enemy was Rana Pratap, and the story that, he's known for his great valor and so on. So, the genealogy that Gaga Bhatt came up with was that Shivaji, this great Maratha emperor, was actually a descendant of Rana Pratap. He was not a Maratha otherwise. Now, all this was in the context of Shivaji's desire to be anointed a Chhatrapati so that he can legitimately deal with Aurangzeb on equal terms. But this is the position that the Brahmin section of his community took. Now, none of this story, this fascinating story that I shared with you just now, is not my discovery. It is well known among historians. Even somebody like Ambedkar talks about it in his books. Now, what was a discovery in my book was that in the 19th century, when these battles were being fought in courts on the question of locating certain jatis, certain castes in the Varna hierarchy, they were all of this anxiety, they all had this anxiety. Look, I should be recognized given my relatively comfortable position, given my social standing. I shouldn't be considered a Shudra. I should be considered a Kshatriya. But just like in Shivaji's time, even in the 19th century, even in this modern era, Brahmins of 19th century took the position that there were no Kshatriyas or Vaishyas in existence. So this question had to be determined in colonial courts. And they went all the way to, believe it or not, to Privy Council in London, where these parties, Indian caste leaders from both sides had to go and say, look, you tell us, this is the kind of evidence we have, you tell us whether we still exist in the 19th century or not. Today it's a very different position. Today they say we need, intellectual kshatriyas and stuff like that. But not too long ago, our elite took the position that kshatriyas don't exist at all. And it's a very self-defeating position. It's a position that emasculated our society because it meant that we did not, in terms of caste, have the tradition of valor. That is what was the signal that our own elite was giving to us.
But is this only a certain region of the country? Because is it only, there were Kshatriyas among the Rajputs, there's the Kshatriyas not too far from here, the Kodavas, those were the Kshatriyas actually, right?
These are all, after these battles were fought in the 19th century, and after the colonial courts in different cases established, in the case of Vaishyas, it was none other than, Bombay, in the Bombay High Court, you had an Indian judge taking the position that Vaishyas also exist. So this is how, through the medium of colonial courts, the Chaturvarna, that theoretical framework I told you about, was restored, contrary to the position taken by Brahmins. So we might otherwise regard Brahmins as the custodians of our scriptures. But not too long ago in the 19th century, and from the days of Shivaji, as we know, they were of the view that you must disregard what is there in our scriptures. Chaturvarna existed in earlier yugas, not in Kali Yuga. So that position was what was actually something
and I
that
like
was weakening our society.
how you weighed between what our scripture said and what our codified laws then were. How many of you have had intercaste marriages? If you have, believe me, it's been an easy ride for you compared to what it was. If you pick up the newspapers, at least in some parts of the country, it's still, you'll read about an entire family which was wiped out. In fact, just yesterday's newspaper had the story from Bihar, where a girl and a boy elope, and they get married, they have a child, they come back home, and the woman's father and brother come and gun down the entire family. The three of them, newly married couple with a baby child, an infant child, just gunned down because of intercaste violence. These are things which you keep reading about, and you think that it is something which happens to others. But believe me, it's not something which happened to others. We've had it easy because our earlier generations fought for it. And when you read this, you realize that some of our founding fathers, who we all deify now as gods, literally, you can't even speak a word about them, not in your families, not in your writings and all, because, oh my God, how dare you question them? Because they have their sect of followers, and then as soon as you say something in social media, you'll get trolled, there's a cancel culture.
Yeah.
But when you read a book like yours, it goes to show that how they defended that kind of caste practices, which today would be totally unacceptable. So what I found interesting, I of course went to that page first. One was about, which I'll honestly tell you, when I saw the book, it was daunting. So first I read about intercaste marriages, and then I read about the right of women to cover the upper half of their body. And what a task even that was, to battle social conditioning as well as laws, to get where we are in the position that we can choose our own attire. And even now, it's a fight for women to choose, to be able to choose what they want to wear. So first, let's talk about the Avarna and Prativarna, right? No. Anuloma and Pratiloma, sorry.
Yeah.
Anuloma and Pratiloma. These are the two ones, and I was wondering which category I come in. And then when I realized that I'm in Pratiloma, and then the children I have had are Chandals.
Yeah.
As per your book, this is what happened.
If the traditional caste system still prevailed, if our constitution did not overturn that, to whatever extent it was possible legally, her children, because she is an upper caste woman, married somebody who's a little lower in the social scale, caste scale, so her children were traditionally considered Chandalas. This was the form of marriage that was, frowned upon. They were
and it's
deeply
not
averse
just
to
the
it.
label of Chandala. They would not have inheritance. They
Yeah.
would not be able to own land. It wasn't just social ostracization. Children of these kind of marriages, it wasn't just social ostracization. They didn't have legal rights.
Yeah.
That is the most frightening thing.
In fact, if they were called Chandalas, if they were labeled so, it was to say that it was to signal that they were unfit for human interaction, that the only occupation they could have was to work in cremation grounds. They could only deal with corpses. So it was their way of signaling that this is a very forbidden form of intercaste marriage. Now, what are these two forms of intercaste marriage? But before we come to that, I must begin with how this intercaste marriage came to be legalized courtesy of a 30-year battle. That battle commenced in the year 1918 thanks to the efforts of one reformist sect, which is also considered revivalist in a different context. I'm referring to Arya Samaj. They persuaded Vithalbhai Patel, the elder brother of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, to introduce the first ever bill seeking to legalize intercaste marriage and to legitimize the status of the offspring of such marriages, right? Now, he did this in the year 1918 in what was then called Imperial Legislative Council. And what do you think was the response? He strategically, in order to appeal to the fellow members in the council who were all from privileged castes, in order to appeal to them, he very strategically cites examples affecting Brahmin women. The kind of marriage he was referring to, that is pratiloma. There were instances that he cites of Brahmin women marrying people from lower castes, and as a result of that, since it was anyway, intercaste marriage was forbidden, when they had problems, when they sought legal remedies on being abandoned and some such matrimonial problems, the court said, no, there is nothing we can do about it because in the eyes of law, you are not even married. Your relationship is not recognized. So there's nothing we can do. Now, he cites such examples to drive home the point that it was time that Hindu society woke up to this injustice that was being suffered by so many people across the board and do away with this anachronistic or retrograde custom. But then the dominant response in the house was of opposition. There was a great pushback he faced from the Hindu right. When I say Hindu right, it should not be mistaken for the Hindu right that we are accustomed to dealing with in today's context. Because remember, RSS was yet to be born. I'm talking about a debate that took place in 1918. RSS was born only in 1925. And at that time, Hindu Mahasabha did exist, but it was still in a nascent form. It was still largely in provincial areas.
So tell us about what Motilal Nehru said.
No, it's not Motilal Nehru. It is Madan Mohan Malviya who
And
was
Motilal Nehru, right? Because
No,
he was, what I'm trying to say is that there were the congressmen who were also...
Motilal Nehru's name figures in a different context. That is Sati.
Sati.
Yeah, that happened earlier. This is in the context of intercaste marriage. In the Imperial Legislative Council, there were prominent Congress leaders like Madan Mohan Malviya and Surendranath Banerjee, both of who at different times were president of Congress party. And Malviya went on to become the president of Hindu Mahasabha as well, besides becoming Congress president one or two more times. And I'm referring to the man who, after the current government came to power in 2014, he was within a few months conferred Bharat Ratna. So he is somebody who is still a very revered figure in the Hindu right. So, but the Hindu right of that time was within the Congress fold. Congress, as you know, was a big tent representing all shades of opinion. And Malviya and to a lesser extent Banerjee took the position that this was something that was offensive to Hindus, or it is something that should not be entertained because it was going to be diverting attention from the priority of focusing on political struggle. This is something that will polarize society. There are different views on it. And surprisingly, it was not just these two who took that position. From outside the house, even Gandhi echoed the same position. Gandhi also disapproved of this reform measure initiated by Vithalbhai Patel. But thankfully, there were other leaders like Rabindranath Tagore, the internationalist that he was. He said that this is something that was long overdue, and it's a shame that a society that is fighting to shed this colonial yoke is denying freedom to its own people and is perpetuating these kind of retrograde practices and so on. Anyway, to cut a long story short, there was nothing that Patel could do in his lifetime because of the magnitude of pushback that he faced, and there were some more attempts. And in the year 1937, Arya Samaj managed to enact a law for themselves, for that tiny section of Hindu society which considered themselves Arya Samaj. They could have intercaste marriage through the 37 one. But for the enactment of a law that applied across the board to all Hindus, our society, our ancestors, people like Smita, who wanted to marry somebody from a lower caste, had to wait some more years. It happened only in 1949. And at that time, it was a legislator from, I take delight in mentioning that, in this battle for equality, was between two sets of Hindus. You had liberal Hindus on one side, the progressive ones, and the other side were conservative, orthodox Hindus. Of course, almost all the orthodox Hindus were members of upper caste, particularly Brahmin community. But liberal Hindus were not necessarily lower caste. A lot of them were from upper caste. In fact, in the early years, lower caste members had no access to legislatures and courts. So this, these attempts for reforming the caste system were being made by people from upper caste at that time. And here is one example. In 1949, it was one Brahmin legislator from Punjab, Thakur Das Bhargava, who introduced that legislation on the lines of Patel's legislation. And Patel was, he was considered part of the Shudra Varna. That was the accepted category then. And
because Vaishyas were not yet a Varna.
Patels are not Vaishyas.
They are not Vaishyas.
No, they are an agricultural community.
Okay.
So, but it's a very dominant caste. So they would be very uncomfortable. It's much like in this part of the country, Nayars are a dominant caste. Very, they were part of the bureaucracy, part of the army, and so on. But in terms of Varna, they were Shudras. That's something which they wouldn't be very
There was a big battle on that, on the Nambudris.
So there's divided opinion on that. So you have these anomalies.
Yeah.
So it was Thakur Das Bhargava introduced it in 49.
Or the Nadars also that
48.
you talk about, which is very interesting.
Yeah. She is actually raising too many things.
Sorry.
I was attempting to complete the story about intercaste marriage. I completely relate to what you are saying. Yeah. Okay. So let me just wrap up. So in 49, it was passed unanimously. Out went all those concerns of, the kind of rhetoric we hear today, oh, Hindu khatre mein hai. These are the kind of arguments that our leaders came up against, the orthodox Hindus came up against something like reform as desirable as intercaste marriage, right? So in 49, it was unanimously passed. Why? Because it was no more expedient for them to be opposing it. Why? Because after independence, that old scapegoat, colonial rule was not available anymore. They couldn't say that it was colonial rule that was somehow responsible for this practice to be persisting. It would become evident that they are the ones who are blocking this reform for all these years. So they allowed it. But then there was really no change of heart. There was no remorse on the part of Hindu society, as evident from the fact that a recent survey shows that not more than 5% of Hindus engage in intercaste marriage. And as she pointed out, even in this day and age, even in progressive states like Tamil Nadu and Kerala, these intercaste marriages are known to trigger honor killings, where parents of the runaway couple themselves would be so seized of that caste madness that they would kill their own children, you know.
Yeah, you're talking about, I'm going to drag you to the present. I'm going to keep doing that as a journalist. You know, you're talking about progressive states like Kerala and Karnataka. They were not so, which you mentioned in your book, that some of the most dreadful practices of casteism was practiced in Tamil Nadu.
It's dialectics that we see here.
Yeah.
This was the worst part, and today, I mean, so much
Madras presidency.
distance they have crossed.
Yeah.
Madras presidency and Kerala.
So today when we talk about progressive, it's probably because they have been through that fire of having practiced and witnessed so much of casteist practices, and that's why the reform movements.
And since our history, I mean, as is commonly said, history is written by victors. So we found it very convenient for our dominant caste to focus on political struggle. Why? Because the enemy in that freedom struggle is who? It's the white man. It's the colonial ruler. But the enemy in this social reform struggle, which predated the colonial rule and which survived the colonial rule, is who? Is our own elite. Right? So we found that inconvenient. A lot of these stories remained untold. So one such story is that because of this kind of caste restrictions, where as I said, it was not just untouchability here, unapproachability. It meant that you couldn't walk on the same street. So there were battles that were fought not very far from where we are sitting in Kalpatti, and that led to the enactment of the first ever law against untouchability anywhere in the country. And that was in the Madras Legislative Council. And yet we know nothing about this law. This is despite one incredible detail, which is that this law was drafted, piloted, and pushed by a Dalit legislator. Consider the odds he might have had to overcome to pull off this feat. He would have had to sell this idea to fellow legislators who were from dominant caste or upper caste, and on that basis also persuade the colonial administration. Now, who is this legislator I'm talking about? R. Veerayan. I mean, little or nothing is known about him. It's scandalous. All we know is that, yes, in history books it is written that Madras was the first state where the law against untouchability was passed, and they attribute that to the Rajaji regime of 1938. But there was actually a law that preceded it by 12 years, and that law was actually sterner than the one that was passed in 38, because the 38 one is just a declaratory law. It just says any custom that propagates or validates untouchability will not be recognized. But it doesn't define offenses, much less does it penalize them. But the Veerayan legislation of 1926 does both. And that was, in civilizational terms, a breakthrough. Why? Because something that was considered by upper caste to be apacharam, something that is contrary to their achara, something that is part of their religious way of life, their cultural, practice or their cultural capital, was now being overnight considered to be a crime. So that was something which was very difficult for them to accept. And this was a bias that even the Rajaji regime displayed, because they were trying to be so tentative about it that they were content in 38 to just pass such a declaratory law. And they didn't want to do anything further lest they offended these sensibilities of upper caste, for who this was so much a way of their life. So how do you now suddenly treat that as an offense? So the administration was being unduly sensitive to that concern of theirs, but they didn't think much about the fact that, in this modern era, you can't let these practices persist anymore.
Like you talk about this law. Now, it is something that has affected millions of Indians later. It's made life easier for us, but it's not there in our textbooks. None of us would have read about this, and especially for people who live in this area, it's not there in our school and college literature. It's not considered important enough. And of course, because we have a central education system also, it doesn't figure anywhere. And it also brings us to that same point which you were talking about earlier, about the non-visibility, which you talk about unseeability. You know, there are three things which Manoj has in his book when he talks about the Dalits. And it is about untouchability, unapproachability, and unseeability. These are the three aspects of people who have been subjugated for hundreds of years. And he categorizes them and says how difficult it is. Now, why am I talking? I'm going to drag you to the present, because this is something that Rahul Gandhi also mentioned when he spoke to Harvard students. And he said that there are certain Indians who don't see themselves, who don't see, and of course he got laughed at and he got trolled a lot. I guess he didn't have time to explain. And I'm sure that if some of the congressmen and women who are part of his followers and who are interested in knowing about it should read this book to understand probably what he meant. And he might have said it because he spoke to a Dalit who could be a Dalit Muslim, a Dalit Christian, a Dalit Hindu, a Dalit who has changed his religion to go to some other religion. But he is still, or she is still, unseeable, in spite of traversing that path of taking a very difficult path, personally, socially, culturally, of changing the religion. Why does a Dalit, a Shudra, still remain a Dalit, a Shudra, regardless of which religion he or she has, or his parents have changed? Why is he or she still untouchable, unseeable, or is he or she not untouchable, unseeable? And in today's context, when he or she wants to change the way things are, how does he or she go about it? Through the judicial process, through social reform, how, and what are the means?
See, law, as is commonly acknowledged, doesn't change attitudes, especially when we are dealing with a very deeply ingrained, religiously sanctioned prejudice. And when I call it religiously sanctioned, it's not a point of view that I'm expressing. It's the view that these orthodox elements in the battles that I was tracing in this book, they themselves took that position in legislatures and courts. When they were defending these retrograde practices, they would say, this is something that we are entitled to do, or we should be allowed to do because this is what our scriptures say. And they don't limit themselves only to Manusmriti, they go to other scriptures too for defending their position. And at that time, Ambedkar was of the view that migration from villages to cities would, to a great extent, resolve the problem. And he, even otherwise, was of the view that villages, replicate this caste hierarchy in ways that are no more acceptable. But then, what we see is that this untouchability problem in its various sinister, devious forms doesn't exist only in rural areas. We see that erupting or manifesting in all sorts of ways, even in cities and even in educational institutions, even in centers of excellence. We have seen instances in Hyderabad Central University, in IITs, in All India Institute of Medical Sciences. There are these problems arising over and over again. It's because we haven't confronted this demon, we haven't exorcised it, we haven't earnestly dealt with it. So this keeps coming up with it. If I had tried to do a similar book on, say, the intersection of law and race in the US, I would have struggled to find anything substantially new to say. But when it comes to the intersection of law and caste, there's so much to report. There's so much new material to give. And that indicates how little we have followed these issues. We don't even know that for a long time we did not even allow the issue of untouchability to be discussed in our parliament. The silence was broken in the year 1916, by another unknown, unsung hero who happens to be neither a Congress leader nor even a Hindu. He was a Parsi, Manakji Dada Boy. There are several such stories, unknown stories, missed by historians that are in this book. And
this Hindu Khatre mein hai, which you just brought up, I have to pick on this now.
Sure.
So, the Prime Minister in his speech, he keeps saying Dalit, Shoshit, Vanchit. That the government is, that the BJP government is focused on that, and that he at the helm is from 2014 onwards. Since your earlier book was on Godhra in 2014, at that time it came out in 2014, Modi and Godhra. So that's why I'm linking it to your earlier book also. When he came in, he said Dalit, Shoshit, Vanchit. They are the people who have been left out, and Antyodaya, which is part of their agenda, that the last man standing should benefit from that. Whenever he speaks on that, there is a section within his own supporter base who bring about the Hindu Khatre mein hai. He takes both in stride. He takes the Dalit, Shoshit, Vanchit, who are the actual vote givers, and the people who are saying Hindu Khatre mein hai, who are the traditional voter bank, right? Both these are in conflict with the BJP, but vote for the BJP too.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas the India Alliance, consisting of caste-based parties, like say Mr. Lalu Yadav's party, or Mr. Mulayam Singh's party, or even the DMK in the south, or you can be talking about in Karnataka, the caste-based parties which are there, they all specifically talk about caste, specifically talk about it, but they're not reaching the Dalit, Shoshit, Vanchit. Why is it that political activism and caste activism are not in sync?
We're actually now stepping out of the domain of this book. What you are raising actually leads
Apologies for that, Manoj. I just want that
no, sure. I have no issues with
the book
that.
to be relevant
Absolutely.
to children, to those who are practicing journalism also, and students who should know and understand where we came from and why political activism is necessary to bring about social change.
And in the current context, as you well know, that the big caste-related subject that is being debated is whether we should have caste census or not, on the lines that Bihar came up with. Now, let's try and unpack this situation to understand why there are conflicting views on that.
I'm giving you 3 minutes so that we have audience questions also.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up in that. What Congress and, as you said, caste-based parties say is, especially after the breakthrough made by Nitish Kumar government, that other states also should follow that example, and in fact we should have it at the national level. And the argument that they cite is that just as you know the exact figures, the demographics of Dalits and Adivasis, you ought to know the demographic details of OBCs too, especially because of the affirmative action. The percentage of seats reserved for them is even greater than that for these two categories. Why? Because they are acknowledged to be the larger section. They are, as I said, Shudras. Shudras were the default category, right? So majority of Hindus are Shudras. So now that is exactly what was borne out by the findings of the Bihar caste census. It showed that OBCs and most backward classes together were about 63%, and if they were combined with SCs and STs, they come to almost 85%, and upper caste, including upper caste from Muslim community, were barely 15%. Now, this is something that they want to be established to show that there is a disproportionate representation of upper caste in administration and elsewhere, in the corporate sector and elsewhere, right? Now, on the other side, why are they so uncomfortable with it? You must bear in mind that not too long ago, the Modi government introduced, reservations on economic criteria, so economically weaker sections. Now, and that's to the extent of 10%. Now, it was said that in terms of population, in proportion to their population, 10% is greater than what, say, these OBCs would get. OBCs are, as evident from Bihar, if that pattern broadly holds, even if there is some variation, it is clearly the dominant section. So in Bihar, it is 63%. But what's the reservation that OBCs get? 27%. And what's the population that upper castes have? 15%, including Muslims. So even if you take them to be, say, 12% or thereabouts, so you have about 10% reserved for upper castes. This economically weaker section is open only to upper caste Hindus, not to Muslims and not to OBCs or ESCs and STs. So these kind of uncomfortable realities will come to the fore, that they were probably a little too solicitous, a little too generous to upper caste at the expense of the more needy, more deserving sections of society. So there is that discomfort on the part of the other section, though they don't openly oppose it, that through their silence and other such indications have made it clear that they don't want...
So it's not, laws don't necessarily mean that things are going to get better. There are fissures even there. They need to be papered over then.
Well, this is about data collection.
Data, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go into the audience so that, you know, we can get your questions also. Anybody who has a question? Yes, the gentleman there, right at the back. Do you have a mic? Not possible? Should I give this? Why don't you come up? Okay, there.
Good morning, sir. I am coming from Madurai. I am preparing for a civil service exam. Last year, I read the news about a temple where marginalized persons were not allowed, but the officers in the district intervened for them to enter the temple. I noticed that upper caste people from this area accosted the marginalized people by recalling their gods and their historical figures, especially through the terms where our purity is lost, our valor will sustain again, our bravery will speak in the future. Also, a few weeks back in the Tanjore, I had a news about the Hana
Can you
killing.
just get to the question,
Yeah,
please,
what
instead
exactly
of
is the
anecdotal
question? Yeah.
details? Just the question.
What, ma'am?
Just give the question. Don't tell us about atrocities. Everybody knows about them. We are reading the newspapers.
Like the terms like valor, bravery, and the pride, this all again signifies the upper caste propaganda to the youngsters' mind. Is there a way to de-signify the words?
Thanks. So I take that as a question relating to this title, somewhat curious title I gave, Caste Pride. This wasn't meant to suggest that caste was anything for someone to take pride in. It's just to reflect the reality in a matter-of-fact way, and it is to shift the gaze consciously from the plight of untouchables to the evasions, hypocrisies, silences, conflicts and debates among caste Hindus on the subject. Let me also add that caste pride is not something that is betrayed only by upper caste or dominant caste. Even lower caste, even Dalits in their own ways still suffer from this caste pride. You know, I come from Hyderabad, where Malas, a Dalit community, is unlikely to have anybody marrying from Madiga, a Dalit community that is considered even lower. Why? Because they deal with leather work. So you have such caste pride being displayed in different ways across the board.
Any other question?
Yes, sir. In all the discussions, whether in media or by academicians, we used to hear always a very politically racial terminology, upper caste and lower caste. How come this can be justified? After all, upper caste, you can call them as migrant caste, and lower caste can be called as native caste. This is the correct political terminology in the political context. So why do people like you avoid this terminology and support this migrant caste racist ideology called Brahminism. Brahminism, as we all know, is the most advanced technological way to enslave human beings ever
Right.
invented.
Let's not just get into...
So why don't we think about this replacing
got
this
the
technology?
question, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm familiar with this radical discourse by certain academics and activists about lower castes representing the aborigines, the natives of India, and upper caste being from outside. Now, for my purpose, I am a reporter who's approached this subject, beginning with, as I said, my focus on impunity for mass violence. And then I went into these debates that took place in legislatures and courts on different caste reforms. So for my purpose, I didn't have to deal with that subject.
And it's there in that, in the book, when you talk about how it goes from Shudras, then there is the Harijans, then there is the Dalits. So the terminology keeps changing. Har yug mein badalta hai, as they say in the north. It changes in that. And even in private practice, for example, Manoj, like I was reading when Gandhiji, in his private dealings, he would get his wife to clean the toilet. You would have seen the Gandhi film. But when it came to his public posture, at that time, in great detail, Manoj goes in the book about how things changed. So it's a very interesting read.
Yeah, that's very
But then as he's a journalist, right, he's reporting on what happened and not a social reformer. So when he talks about saying a Shudra or a Brahmin or a Dalit, he's not putting that terminology. It's a terminology which was used in pre-colonial, colonial and post-independence time. It's not a stamp of approval that we journalists use when we use those terms. And it is not a stamp of disapproval either. Am I clear in what I'm saying?
Let me add one very fascinating detail that comes through. When the Nehru government introduced the first law relating to untouchability, in 1954, Ambedkar reacts to it in Rajya Sabha, and he, among the various measures he suggests, he comes up with a scathing attack on the government. Now, one of the measures he suggests is that the term untouchable should be used in that law, and it should be defined. Now, this might come as a shock to many of us, because today we are accustomed to seeing it as a politically incorrect term. But not too long ago, after the abolition of untouchability in the constitution, Ambedkar, as an opposition member, came up with this kind of a categorical statement that the word untouchable should be used, not just untouchability. He also mentions that untouchability was not defined in the constitution, so that gap also should be filled by this legislation. So, the times changed, the context in which he said it was different. It is very instructive and very illuminating, and it helps you understand today's fault lines too. So I do urge you to read my book with an open mind, and then you will understand.
Vanakkam, sir, to both of you. My question is one simple question.
I think we are done with the time, and we have other speakers. So I suggest you come out, on the side and with the wings. Sir, I'm sorry, I cannot take your question. We are done. We have other speakers who are waiting. Please come to the side, and Manoj will answer that. Thank you, Manoj, for this very illuminating conversation. And for those who are watching the 2024 elections, and where caste is going to play a very important role, especially for commentators who come on television and write op-ed books, op-ed articles, I suggest reading this book so that we know where we are today and how we reached where we have come today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Manoj.